So yesterday we had an incredible conversation with Doug Wright and Emily Mann, led by Paula Alexson, and we were discussing intention, why an author writes, the inspiration, the process, how they want the work to live on. And all of that really reflects directly on our conversation today. How do we document our legacies, and what do we do with all that paper that we're accumulating? Or at least, I guess maybe we're not accumulating paper today, but drafts on our computer. What do we do? So we're very, very, very honored today to have with us Eric Collieri he's the Klein Curator of Theater and Performing Arts at the Harry Ransom Center, which, if you don't know, is an international humanities research library. It's an archive and a museum, and which just means that Dr. Collieri is involved with one of the largest collection of American, British, Irish playwright archives. Includes Lillian Hellman, Adrian Kennedy, Terrence McNally, Arthur Miller, Tom Stoppard, Tennessee Williams, George Bernard Shaw, Sam Shepard, Oscar Wilde, and this list goes on and on and on. So he has quite a collection there. He is an incredible resource to the theater community on archives, dramaturgy, and history, serves on the board of the American Theater Archive Project and the Theater Library Association. He's a lecturer as well in the Performance and Public Practice program in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of Texas at Austin, and now I can say a very good friend of DG Copyright Management. I hope I can say that. So welcome, Eric, today. I think people are still flooding in to this program, but let's just talk a little bit. I would love to just hear a little bit about your own background, so that I know I sort of gave the cliff notes of your sort of career, but sort of how did you come to archiving, and why? What led you down this path?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here, and I can't thank you enough for having me. I mentioned before we started that you all are my bag. This is like my people. This is really something that's been a lifelong passion. I've always really enjoyed libraries, history, and theater. So I'm very fortunate to have a job that combines all three. I worked professionally in theater for a while as a director and a stage manager in the United States and in Canada, and really then went to graduate school and got a doctorate in theater historiography and museum studies. And that sort of set me up for a couple of years in Minnesota, and then I've been here for 6 years now. So it's been a wonderful journey.
And can you describe a little bit about the type of work that you're doing there then, at the Ransom Center?
Yeah, so as a curator, my responsibility is really, it's sort of the old way of thinking about curation, which is to care for something. So I'm here really to care for the collections, to grow them, to interpret them, to help researchers access them, to work with artists and their estates to really preserve. I loved what you said about authorial intent, and how the archives can be a place where that intention can be found. So we do a lot of work with a lot of different constituencies, not least of which is the general public and how they engage with the collection. So doing exhibits, public programs, making material available online when copyright allows, really working with authors and their estates to think about legacy building and making material accessible.
And can you talk a little bit just about the work that you do with the American Archive Project? Because I think they kind of work together, and we'll be talking a little bit about sort of all the hats I think that you wear today, but it's interesting for people to know.
So yes, so I as curator for the performing arts collections at the Ransom Center, that's one hat. Another one is I serve on the board for the American Theater Archive Project. We're a group of amazing folks at museums and archives and working in the theater profession themselves, really deeply committed to documenting the work of particularly the American theater. So we offer resources. We have an online manual for how to get started with organizing your collection, things to think about in terms of emergency preparedness. A lot of these things are geared towards specifically theater companies, but we also, it's absolutely applicable to individuals as well. So we work a lot with theater companies to help them understand what they have, how they can organize it. Yeah, that sort of thing, what to do with it long term.
And I'm going to just, I forgot to say off the top, if people have questions as we're talking, or you want the name of something again, just let us know. You can post questions in the Q&A, and then I'm going to leave the chat open in case anyone has something profound to say that they'd like to share as well. Okay, so I guess my next question is, because I'm new to sort of the concept. Oh, thank you for doing
Yes.
that. There you go. Now you can
There we go.
see everything. So I wanted to just ask a little bit about archiving and sort of why they're important. Why do we need to archive work? It's for somebody that's sort of coming new to this sort of concept of archiving myself. It's sort of, what is the purpose of it? Does it serve multiple purposes? You go with that, and then I'll follow up.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. It serves multiple purposes at different times. And I think one of the big misconceptions about archives is that it's this big thing, like sort of the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where it's big boxes, long shelves, big rooms, dusty. There's librarians with cardigans and glasses and that sort of thing. It doesn't have to be that. And so I think first and foremost, to think about an archive is to think about what's helpful for you as a writer, as a creator, making sure that a collection of material serves your needs. I'm thinking about someone like Arthur Miller, who kept notebooks and journals throughout his lifetime. And then around 1995, he decided he was going to edit them into a publication. And as he edited them, he realized that he had all of these ideas for stories that he never wrote, that actually he never finished the editing project for his journals, because those last 10, 15 years of his life were really spent making plays based off of ideas that he'd had in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then actually, because of the archive then, and that's sort of gets to your question about sort of different uses, the archive then has been placed here at the Ransom Center, and the estate can then make use of the collection to finish that publication project that Arthur had started in the 90s.
Wow. And I guess when we say archiving, do we have a specific goal in mind, or is it sort of, it seems to be like a large term, which maybe,
So I think the best way to think about it, I've got a lot of papers on my desk. Mm-hmm. An archive or a collection is when you start to look at those papers on your desk and say, I don't really need to keep this receipt from lunch yesterday, but I do really want to keep this letter from so-and-so, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to save my drafts. I'm going to save, journals. I'm going to save my contracts, like those kinds of things. That gesture, that act of setting something aside intentionally is what sort of makes a collection and makes an archive.
So then does everybody have an archive? Everyone that writes has an archive?
Everyone has an archive. Whether they sort of formally realize it as one is the question. So, to think about that, anybody, just to sort of think about what do you save? What do you have for certain projects? Do you have drafts? Do you save multiple drafts? Do you save over the drafts? Do you print things out? Do you have contracts? Do you save letters? Do you have emails? Do you keep production photographs? Do you get a copy of the stage manager's Bible? Are you on the list to receive performance and rehearsal reports? All of those things could be part of your archive. And it's not just, and this is something I think that's also really important too, it is what you want it to be. And some people are very careful and active about crafting their archive in a way that they want it to be crafted. So someone like Lillian Hellman very intentionally wanted her archive to really reflect her work and not so much her personal life. So there aren't journals, and there's, a lot of the letters, there's some exceptions, but a lot of the letters really focus on her professional activities. whereas other people will include journals.
But then that's something that you have to actively think about as you're writing. Because I guess maybe naively, I think, okay, well, I've been writing for 40, 50 years. Now I'll go and look and see if I have an archive. But it sounds like archiving one's work is something that's proactive and something that happens year to year.
It can be. I think you can. There are certainly people who don't think about it until, they've been writing for 50, 60 years, and then they sort of look back and they're like, oh gosh, what am I going to do with all this? Or and they've already been using it. I mean, that's the thing. This has already been fodder for grant applications or for new ideas for projects, or you go back through these things for different reasons. But absolutely, it can change the way that you think about the collection if you are actively crafting it as you're going along. It can be easier too, because then you're sort of staying on top of keeping it organized maybe. But if you don't sort of think about it early, and this is why I always try to encourage people to think about it early and to have these conversations early, because you could really run the risk of losing things. I've talked to folks before who say, I do print off drafts and I, mark up the revisions and that kind of thing, but I just don't have the room to save this stuff. So I throw it away. And so all I have are my digital drafts that are sort of unmarked and uncorrected. And that's a different thing. And so, there's also people, I'm thinking about someone like Lynn Nottage too, who, there's a play like Sweat, but then there's her response, her work in Reading, Pennsylvania, where she created a sort of art installation with a community. And to me, there's Sweat, the play that she wrote, but then this other piece, what she called, I think, the Reading Project for a while. The Reading Project is an extension in some ways. It is almost a sort of archival documentation of the practice of engaging with this community, and is actually deeply connected to the play itself. And so being artists, I mean, this is a really exciting thing. You can think about your work as even the work of the archive itself as an extension of your artistic practice. And what you create can be an archival document that sort of responds, that helps you sort of capture a particular moment in time or a particular part of your process.
And do you have to sort of assess this as you go along? I mean, should you, when we talk about sort of, is it worth it? Is it, is there value in, so say I want to do this, I'm interested and I'm going to be active, I'm going to maybe have an angle, in terms of what I want to collect. But then do you have to at some point look at it and say, is there value here, or is that for others to decide?
It sort of depends on what your ultimate goals are, and that's, I think, something each individual person will have a different sort of take on it. If you feel like it's important if you want this collection to be preserved and made accessible to more people than just you, then you might consider placing it at an institution. Like a place like the Ransom Center or the Harvard Theater Collection or New York Public Library. There's tons of places around the country that preserve collections like this. So yes, there might be that time where you say, actually, I'm getting emails from people who are interested in looking at my papers, but I don't want them rifling through, my closet in my bedroom or something like that. And that's certainly helpful to know. In those cases, you can work with people like me at these institutions where we have a conversation and say, like, okay, well, what do you have? How does this reflect your work? How does this reflect your process? Are there things that are missing from this that would really help reflect your process that maybe you haven't thought about as part of your archive before? And then, there's certainly, even with the Dramatists Guild, like you were saying, this idea of authorial intent could be very important for whoever's managing the rights to these works in terms of someone's estate. And so making sure that they have access to these documents and these, the drafts and the letters and statements of intent, it's so important.
I mean, you raised a really interesting point before too, when you were talking about the digital copies. Because I imagine that as we become more of a digital world and we're typing on computers more than using, paper and pencils, that maybe the nature of the archives have changed. Is that true?
Yes. Oh, totally. I mean, you can actually see the moment when typewriters become popular, people's handwriting starts to get messier. And then it gets really messy when computers come in. And then there's a point when you almost largely stop seeing handwritten material at all, if it, beyond marginalia. Yeah, so these are all really important things to think about. If you have, anybody who's working digitally right now, I would encourage you to think about that. You do have to be actually very proactive about saving digital files in a way that you may not think about it with your paper stuff, because it's just sort of physically there in your home maybe. But the digital files, if your computer crashes or you buy a new desktop or something like that, what happens to your emails? Did you transfer those over? Did you transfer over all your files? If you've been working like in WordPerfect in 1993, can you still open that? Mm-hmm. These are really important things to think about. I always recommend that folks back up their material at least on their hard drive and to a cloud server, so that there's at least two places where it always is. So if something happens to your computer, if it gets stolen or broken or whatever, you can access it at least on the cloud. But if your cloud subscription disappears, you'll have it at least somewhere else. It is a commitment. It's an investment that you have to do. I use things like Box, Google Drive, any of these, Cloud, OneDrive, where the software is installed on your computer. You can make a directory and then it automatically syncs into the cloud, so that you don't really even have to think about it. Those are sort of good practices.
I have a question here, like related to that. Somebody's asking, what defines an archive? How can you use different types of multimedia to preserve an artist's life? And I guess are the different, and maybe they are, is from what I'm hearing, these sort of other things beyond the scripts, conversations you've had or recordings that you make. How does that fit in?
Every archive is remarkably different from each other. And so, there will be, for a playwright's archive, you might, traditionally find manuscript drafts, typescripts. You'll find, sort of consistent things across the collections. As a curator, what I'm always really interested in is a sense of how a collection documents a person's process, also how it's a snapshot of that person's life and that person's contributions to a broader field and industry. So, it's not just one person and their work, right? Theater doesn't exist in a vacuum. So how does this one person's work speak to other things that are going on in the world during their lifetime? And so, in terms of multimedia and sort of maybe creative responses to archiving and documentation, I'm really open and excited to those ideas. And I never really personally want to limit it, because I do think that actually creating an archive is an artistic process, that ideally the person who created the material should be actively involved in. So if there are things that they want to say, but maybe they don't have those drafts anymore, or, we have substantial literary archives here at the Ransom Center too. And I'm thinking about the novelist Katsu Ishiguro, who before his papers came here, he actually went through the entire collection and wrote on little Post-it notes, notes to future researchers about like what this paper is and why it's important to him, why it was important for him to save it. It's crazy. I mean, that's like so time intensive, but it's like he's like sitting there with you, going through it as you're working your way through the collection. Amazing.
That's really cool. That's intentional. Somebody else is asking though, if you're not particularly anybody and you sort of have these papers, like how do I know if it's going to be of interest to an institution down the line? Like what, how do, if you're going to invest all those Post-it notes, you might have some thought that like it's of value.
Well, it is always a value. That's what I mean. It's always a value, no matter what. Certainly to you, certainly to your estate, certainly to other researchers. And so, you can't always shake your crystal ball at the beginning of one's career and sort of see how it's going to play out. But always think about that. And honestly, there are institutions that will be interested. There's a handful of us that do specific work in performing arts, but then a lot of writers and artists will look to their alma maters, and oftentimes they will have archives, or in some cases, especially if you've been rooted in a particular community for a long time, a local historical society or university archive, or public library in some cases will take on archives. So there's places where this goes, but you want to make sure that there's something there to begin with, right? And first and foremost, it needs to serve you. It needs to be a resource to you as an artist to be able to go back and reference, and then to your estate after you pass on, so that they do understand things like authorial intent and who owns the copyright, and what sort of rights were granted with publication of different works, and all of that kind of thing.
So interesting. I just want to remind people to please use the Q&A. It's a little bit easier. I don't want to miss your questions, which are flowing in the chat. So try to copy and paste them over there. I want to jump in a little bit into a little bit more nitty-gritty conversation. Although maybe I'll ask this one person's question since it's a little bit more general. And sort of hit on this already. They're asking if a collection can be considered an archive if it contains third-person accounts about a theater artist, nothing directly written by them. So maybe an archive comprised of oral histories that are documented after the person, passed away or something like that. Can that be an archive? Is that an archive if you didn't write it?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Well, it's a collection. Yeah. So what we would say, like, in some cases we'll collect. So at Tennessee Williams, for example, we have 42 collections at the Ransom Center that deal with Tennessee Williams in some way. So there's Tennessee Williams's papers. We have his mother's papers. There's his agent, Audrey Wood. Laurette Taylor was the original Man in the Glass Menagerie. Paul Bowles, who was the composer for a number of his works. Each one of them is really interesting on their own. And sometimes it's really sort of focused on like the Audrey Wood collection of Tennessee Williams. So it's really focusing potentially on her work with this person and not maybe her archive more broadly. So absolutely, there's ways of doing that. And if it's especially original material, unique material that you can't get anywhere else, that's so valuable to researchers. Those unique records are a gem to the future.
Okay, so I want to get a little bit into the nitty gritty, and that's, I think, a lot of the navigating too many open windows. But yes, I think that's where a lot of the questions are coming in. So I'm going to do this. I want to do this. Help. What do I do? What's the first thing I need to do? And I guess you referenced as well the protocols. Somebody's asking where to get access to those. So if those flow into this conversation, which they might, or we could pop that in the chat if you want.
Yes, I'm going to pop the link to the manual again here. This is from the American Theater Archive Project. So this will give you a good, again, it's sort of directed to theater companies, but it's also very much applicable to individual artists as well. It is incredibly overwhelming, I realize, to sort of start thinking about this. And so what I always suggest is that you really don't let it overwhelm you, that any work you do towards organizing your papers is work that you don't have to do later. So really, I would just start by looking around and seeing what you have. Check your closets, check your office, check with your friends, check with your parents. Parents are the first archivists, and it's amazing how much sometimes they save. Yeah, check around and see what's there. Pay attention to how you're saving it. And really just even the small things that you can do right away, like, oh, I'm keeping, these manuscripts or these drafts and boxes in my basement, and the basement floods every 2 years, or, be attentive to like not keeping things under pipes, or really realizing that your material, anything that's precious to you, family photographs, that sort of thing, anything really, it likes the same environment that you do. So not too humid, not too hot, not too cold, between like 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, relative, it's that kind of environment is really what you want for it to be preserved in long term. And that's something really easy you can do right away. Once you start gathering that together, you can actually just start making a list and say, well, I've got, here's all the plays that I've written, or all the scores that I've composed. And say, well, okay, for this project, I've got this, for this project, I've got this, and I'm going to sort of group all that together. Absolutely, that's a very sort of easy thing to do. If you find that like all of your files are really messy, like on your computer, and it's very overwhelming to think about how to organize that, how to start organizing it, just start. Just do like 10 minutes a day. Just start making folders, and maybe organizing it by project, or organizing it by year, or however makes sense to you. And then just chip away at that backlog. And then the more you do it, the sooner it'll be a resource to you.
Is there any kind of formal sort of indexing that needs to take place for an institution to look at work?
No, that's, and in many ways actually. So what an institution will try to do always is to preserve first in the same way that you're looking at it, Deborah, with authorial intent. We're looking at archival intent. So we try to, like if we get your papers, we're not going to take somebody else's collection of their papers about you and mix them in. So we're trying to preserve, this is what you collected, this is what you saw as your archive. And so there's that sort of limitation. And then we're also interested in preserving its organization. And you don't need to sort of create that inventory unless it's helpful to you to be able to navigate it. But that's really the job of archivists down the road. If you are interested in placing it at an institution at some point, it's very helpful for that institution to know, generally at least, what's in the collection, to have some sort of description. In some cases, oftentimes a representative from the institution will try to come and see it in person, just to get a better sense of what's there. It's a huge commitment on an institution's part to take on a collection, because it's not just a temporary thing. There's a commitment to saving this stuff in perpetuity. So it's very important that they understand what they're taking into the collections. But that work, that labor of organizing it and putting it in nice boxes and creating good inventories, that's really something that's done by an institution. It can be done by the individual if it's helpful to you.
Although I would just add to that, just in terms of managing, as someone who's in the world of managing work, when the author is not there anymore, what is so helpful is that organization as well. So even if you're just thinking for future generations in terms of licensing your work, to be collecting along with your archive any contracts you have relating to that work, things like that can really, really help sort of keep the work living for many, many years. Somebody's asking if there's a specific box or something like that. So if they have a lot of hard copy materials and they want to protect them, they're going to take them away from the pipes. But, is there a specific kind of box or something that these things should be stored in?
Yeah, great question. So there's the Library of Congress actually has some resources about that too. Sort of look under the sort of preserving family history section and you'll see some good tips there. Generally, like I said, they prefer the same climate that you do. And so I tend to discourage a little bit using things like plastic boxes, just because they can sometimes they create their own sort of like microclimate in there, and sometimes it grows mold. And it's nice sometimes to be able to have some circulating air. There's certainly, if you wanted to invest in sort of nice quality boxes, there's places like Gaylord or other sort of like archival supply companies. But really, you could go to Home Depot and buy, record storage boxes, cardboard record storage boxes. And as long as they're being stored in environments that are not too humid, not going to get moldy from, broken pipes or leaky basements, then it should be in pretty good shape.
I just have another question here. If there are people that you can hire to do this kind of work, and I don't know if you need somebody specific to do this kind of work, does it need to be somebody that's sort of been in the world of archives, or are there places where you can find people who know how to do it well?
Yeah, if you're really trying to organize it and you feel like you really don't have the time to commit to it. And again, organizing doesn't have to be like, it shouldn't, don't get overwhelmed by that. It can be overwhelming, but it doesn't need to be. If you want to work with an archivist, absolutely. That same link that I sent to you, I put in the chat window there for the manual for archiving for theater companies. There's also, you'll see a link there for consulting archivists. If you have questions more broadly about sort of what to do, or sort of good practices, you can always email us there at the American Theater Archive Project, and we can help answer those. If you're looking to hire someone to do this kind of work, I'd certainly recommend someone with experience with archives. You can find people with degrees in masters in library science or in information studies. You can go to websites like the Society of American Archivists, and they have postings and job call boards and that kind of thing, and you can connect with people who are certified and really understand what it means to put a collection together.
I want to talk a little bit about just finding a home for work, because I think this is, it's a lot of work. If we're going to go through it, we want to feel like it's going to have somewhere to go. So you talked a little bit about, local libraries, things like that. I mean, what are sort of the top places for people to look once they've sort of collected everything, organized everything, protected everything, then they can try to find a home?
Absolutely. I'll post a link here to the Theater Library Association. They maintain a list of performing arts libraries, archives, and museums. It's broken down geographically across the country. This is a really good place to start. Sometimes it's also just really helpful to ask, and I'm very frank with people about this, and I want people to come and ask questions, and I can wear different hats. And so even if you're not interested in placing your papers at a place like the Ransom Center, I can try to connect with you. Even when we can't take a collection, we always try to help find the right place for you. So sometimes, again, that's an alma mater. Sometimes it's looking to your peers and saying, this person is someone I've worked with for a long time. They have placed their papers at this institution. My papers would actually, benefit from being in the context with these people. So if someone's coming to do research, on that person, that makes sense that my papers are there as well. That's oftentimes how the collections are built, is finding these networks and sort of being a place where people can come and do research that connects to all of these different networks. So you can also always, I'll put my contact information in here too, but I'm always happy to chat with folks. So you can set up a time on my calendar to just to talk about your work, to talk about your archive. If you have questions about gathering your stuff together. You also, it may be that you decide ultimately that you don't want to place it somewhere, and that's okay too. The important thing is that there is a collection that's there to help you, to help your family, and that there is something at the end of the day.
So what do you, when somebody calls you and says, hey, could you take on these boxes, what's sort of your thought process? And that might be a reflection of what the Ransom Center collection consists of.
Yeah, generally speaking, our first question is to try to, it's really to try to get a better sense of what's there. So, we'll be interested in knowing about your work, about what the collection looks like, how big it is, what kind of condition it's in, how well it does or doesn't document your process, how complete it is it? Do you only have like the final copies of all of your of all the drafts? Is it like the published copy, or do you show a broader sense of process? A library, the difference between a library and archive is that you can go to a library, many libraries, and see that final published version of a play or a musical score or a musical book. But this is, an archive was really focusing more on process and getting a sense of the bigger picture. So we're really interested in seeing how well the collection does that. The questions of size and condition are mainly because we need to be able to fit it into the stacks, to have a sense of what our commitment will be in terms of needing to invest in rehousing it, processing the collection, conserving it. We have at places like the Ransom Center, we have on-site conservation staff who, if things are mold damaged or brittle or in bad shape, they can sometimes repair it or at least stabilize it. But all of that is an investment. So those are the sort of first questions we'll ask whenever we're approached.
Somebody's asking if there's sort of a good time to ask. Is there like maybe a high season, a low season, a prime time?
Yeah, there's never a bad time to start a conversation. I personally find that when I have conversations with people in the theater profession, a lot of people aren't thinking about it until later in their career. And it's just sort of thinking about like, okay, well, I've got all this stuff at my house. I don't know what to do with it now. But certainly there are times where we'll have conversations with people over 40 years. So they'll start placing their archive somewhere, and then they'll continue to add to it over decades. It's really, I think it's so important if you do decide to place your collection somewhere, it's important that you feel like you can trust them. It's important that you feel like you still have access to that collection after it's left your home or your office or your workspace. It's important to ask those questions. You should feel like the people that are responsible for your collection at an institution are there as partners with you, that it's a relationship that isn't just about placing the collection and then you don't talk ever again, but that it's an ongoing relationship that will continue your whole life.
So you would take on a rather young artist, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. And we have done that before. In some cases, the person, that'll be it. Like that person will have done maybe, a handful of plays in their 20s, and maybe they move on to a completely different career. And to me, that's fascinating. That's absolutely an important part of the story of American theater, of that person's life and profession. And yeah, absolutely.
Do you have like scouts that go out and sort of watch theater? How do we get your attention if we don't know you? How do we, and besides, calling, now you give us all your emails, so we may just attack you, but how would you find someone? Yeah.
Honestly, there's very few institutions that have the staff and the resources to be able to approach, everybody that we're interested in. I've got certainly, hundreds of people in mind, of people who I would love to be able to have a conversation with about their archives. But that's, I don't have that ability to be able to reach out to everybody at the same time. Oftentimes, we will work with a literary agent to sort of start those conversations. Oftentimes, an individual writer will reach out directly and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. Do you have any advice? Do you have, here's what I've got so far. Is this something that you'd be interested in now? Should I hold on to it till later? Let it be a conversation. And again, think about it as a relationship, and not necessarily just, it is a very personal thing to place an archive and to sort of think about questions of legacy and estate planning and how researchers and artists will look back on your work in the future. It's deeply personal, but it's also a conversation. so don't be shy about that. This is exactly why people like me exist at these institutions. We're here to have these conversations with you.
Okay, I'm going to turn a little bit to the chat, so the topics may become a little varied.
Sure.
Or not linear. Somebody is asking, any recommendations for what to donate while you're still alive and what to hang on to?
That's a great question. What I would really suggest, that gets to the question of how accessible the material will be to you when it leaves your custody. So absolutely, you need to have that clarified, and you can even get that in writing as part of your agreement, and you probably should get it in writing as part of the agreement with the institution when you place your papers. So ask them, if I need to see a draft of something and the archive is not anywhere near where I live, will you scan it for me? How many scans can I get a year? How does that process work? Who's my point person? So that you really, because if you decide that you want to go back to a work again, you don't want to feel like that material is inaccessible to you. Even after it leaves your custody and goes to an institution, it first and foremost, in my opinion, first and foremost, it should always be accessible to you as the artist and creator. So check with that. And depending on what their response is, you may decide like what you want to let go of and what you want to hold on to, especially if you know that there's things that you want to return to later on. Also, you can at that time have a discussion about future editions and how that works. So if you're continuing to create new works, if you plan on sending material again later on down the road, it's very important that the institution understands that. You may not be able to make an agreement until that time comes for that material to be there, but it's very helpful to have that sort of open relationship and open expectation of how a collection might continue to grow. Because
the institution's owning the actual physical copy.
Yeah. So when you place a collection at an institution, really the collection, there's very few cases where this isn't the case, but you are transferring the property, the ownership of the property to the institution. So you don't physically own it anymore, but the copyright, unless you specify otherwise, the copyright remains with you as the artist.
So then somebody is also asking here that if institutions pay for the archive.
Yeah, some do. We do occasionally, and there are other institutions that do. There are only a handful of us that have that kind of budget to do that. It's a really hard thing to do, and it's getting harder every year, I think, for every institution to do this. Most institutions that preserve archives are completely nonprofit, like painfully nonprofit. Like we don't charge for anything. So like here at the Ransom Center, we're an archival library and a museum that's based at the University of Texas at Austin. So we have exhibits, we have public programs, we have a reading room, but we don't charge for access to any of that. It's very important to us that those programs and exhibits and research in the reading room is open to everybody. And we don't want money to be a barrier to access. But that means that our only income streams are endowments and university and state support and donations. And so it's tricky. So there have been sort of larger collections that have been bought and sold on the market before, and there's sometimes you can connect with booksellers. I would recommend looking at like the American Association of Booksellers, or the they can, there's lists of people who are credentialed sort of booksellers who work in archives, who can help you place your papers at an institution. You don't need to work with someone like that, but you can, and they can help, especially if you're looking to sell them, they can sometimes help negotiate values and that kind of thing.
And just the flip of that, is there ever a fee or some kind of cost associated, that the author would have to give to the institution, or is that like a big red flag?
It's not a red flag. There are increasingly more archives that, there are increasingly archives that will say that, we can take this collection as a gift, but they'll also potentially ask for funding to help process it, just because the upfront costs of taking in a collection are so high. In those cases, it is helpful to sort of just also, it's not a red flag by any means if they ask you. You do want to make sure that they are able to care for the collection in perpetuity. And so in that case, you might consider visiting the collection. How do the rest of the collections look? Is there a fund available for conservation treatments down the road if something happens to your material? How are they funded? Is it supported by a larger institution? Is it supported by endowments? Or are they sort of being funded maybe by a model of like private donations that might potentially dry up at some point? Those are really helpful questions to ask.
And then what would a reasonable fee then be, if I could ask?
That really would depend on the institution and how big the collection is. And if you don't feel like you have to, if you don't, if you feel like you want to sell your papers, there's no problem going and asking. And any institution will be very upfront and say, okay, well, maybe we can do that, or actually, we just don't have the budget for that. Similarly, like if they say, well, we can accept it as a gift, but we need some funding to come with it. You feel free to say, okay, well, let me think about that, or I don't know if this will work. Let me check with maybe another institution. And you might end up coming back to them again later on down the road, but decide what's important to you. I think it's just, I think sometimes there have been cases in the past where people will look to their archive as a sort of retirement strategy, that they'll sell their papers and it will help them, support them later in their life. It is a very hard thing to do, and it is increasingly becoming more difficult as institutions just really don't have the kind of funding to do that. And oftentimes there's a discrepancy between what a collection is worth monetarily and what an institution can actually afford to pay. And that's heartbreaking whenever that happens. And again, another reason why, having conversations early on is helpful, because then, you can really lay things out, make good plans, and sort of think through possibilities without waiting until it becomes sort of urgent.
Do authors or materials ever get sort of taken out of the archive, or is it a guarantee, or is that just contractual? Because I know sometimes, like, with a publisher, your play may fall out of the catalog or something like that. Is there anything like that would happen in archiving?
Well, not quite. I mean, there's certainly cases where, you're transferring the property and the ownership of the material. So once it's transferred, then it's transferred. What you can do is if there's material that's especially sensitive to you, that you want to have preserved for posterity, but you maybe don't want it to be accessible immediately, you can ask the institution if they would restrict it for a period of time. So sometimes that's the period of your life as the creator, or the period of the life of someone else, or you could just give a general sort of like, we'll say 5 years, 10 years, something like that. But you do need to be able to have a written agreement of when that material will be available. And really, I don't know of any institution that will take any material that won't at some point be made available publicly. Otherwise, there's no point in having it. In terms of being able to take material out of the collection, it's rare, and I would ask the institution about that as you're sort of talking through agreements. There are cases certainly where we will collaborate with artists, creators, theater companies, institutions, other institutions. If there's like a retrospective of someone's work, for example, sometimes we'll scan original manuscripts for like lobby displays or for presentations or programs or documentaries or that kind of thing. And we will loan out material to museums or spaces at least that are can promise that it's secure and not going to be damaged. And there's sort of insurance costs with that too. But so there are ways that material can be taken out and put on display. We just had a big exhibit in collaboration with the Morgan Library a couple of years back with Tennessee Williams, big exhibit on Adrienne Kennedy at Artist Space in New York. So there's ways that it can leave the building. But in terms of just like, if I wanted to get that manuscript back because I want to work on it again, that would be very hard for an institution like us. We don't usually do that. We would usually provide a scan, but we want to be as helpful and supportive as possible with that work.
We have a couple questions about sort of long-term storage in like a digital medium. So should we put it on a USB drive? Should it be on a CD? How should it be packaged or organized electronically to be best preserved?
You want multiple redundancies and you want to check them often. I think a lot of people think that having it on an external hard drive is good because it sort of saves it and then they'll put it on the shelf and forget about it. But honestly, those external hard drives, depending on the quality of it, can last sometimes only up to like 5 years. So you don't really want to that shouldn't be your only backup. That's why having a sort of combination of hard drive, whether it's internal or external hard drive, a combination of a hard drive and a cloud server, and having that redundancy, having it saved in 2 places, is at least 2 places is ideal. And if you can set up something with like a Google Drive or a Box or a OneDrive or one of those cloud servers, where it automatically syncs between a hard drive and the cloud, you won't even have to think about it. It'll just do it automatically. And that's really the best practice.
We have one question asking if you could give an example, I don't know if you can, of what you have paid for a famous writer's archive.
Honestly, it's so tricky to be able to, it doesn't even depend on the person's reputation necessarily. It's not about reputation, it's about the quality of the collection and how big it is, and also the funding available at that time and whether there's any donors who can support that an acquisition. The concept of a fair market value for an archive is constantly changing. And so, sometimes we'll pay a sort of nominal fee, like of maybe a couple $1,000 because that's really maybe all we have. Sometimes it's more, but it's tricky, and it's always just very challenging because it's sometimes you don't want the price, the offer, the financial offer to be seen as representative of the institution's respect for that person. It's really, they're 2 very different things. The budget and the commitment to that person and the recognition of that person's importance are very, very different things.
So we have a question here by a writer artist who works with other estates and other artist archives. and is asking what advice you might have for somebody who works with artists and works with the artist projects as well.
Well, thank you for doing that work. That's a very important work. And I can only imagine that in that role, you are also seeing just the sort of very different practices across, each person's, work. So I guess, yeah, see if you can find ways of streamlining some of those processes. So if you find that there are kinds of materials or certain timelines that work really well, like I'm thinking about if the normal timeline of a theater production, for example, there's the drafting process, there's rehearsals, there's opening night, there's the run of the show, there's closing, there's strike, and then there might be a tour, or there could be future iterations of a production. Finding those moments in the process to check in with your artist or with a theater company, with all the sort of various stakeholders they may be working with, to try to collect in those moments, right? So at the end of strike, like if you are working for a scene designer, or if you are working for a composer who's collaborating with several other people, if you wait till strike, sometimes it's already too late. The other people have moved on to other projects. So maybe you want to get them at the end of rehearsals, or at the beginning, just after opening night or something like that. So you'll find those moments, I think, and just sort of creating those patterns to check in with folks, I think is probably the best advice I can give.
And I know we're got to close out soon, but I have a question about royalties, and I want to make sure that people understand does the institution take any part of the royalties generated from the work? How does the future sort of income earned by the work affect the institution, or are totally unrelated?
It can, and that's again, this is about sort of relationship development. So if you build a relationship with the institution that houses your archive, and you want to continue to support them, you can assign in your will royalties or a portion of royalties to an institution, and that's something that can be worked out with. Really, any institution would be incredibly grateful, I imagine, for such a relationship. But it's certainly not expected, and it's not, I would say, common, but it is certainly very helpful. And you can also, as part of that, have conversations about what those royalties could do. So if you wanted, for example, to use those royalties to endow a research fellowship, to encourage people to come and make use of the collections, that's possible. If you want naming rights on a part of a building, that could be possible. If you want to endow, funding for future acquisitions or additions to your collection, or future preservation needs for your collection, that's all potentially possible depending on the institution. So it's not expected, and there's certainly the only thing that's really transferring generally to an archive is the property, and anything else is open for discussion, and could certainly be taken on a case-by-case basis.
We have a fun question. What is one of your favorite items in your catalog at the Ransom Center?
Oh boy. So my collections date back to like the 11th century and all the way up through the present. And I'll actually put this here in the chat window too before folks leave. We're currently collecting, around the pandemic, a major international project called the Theater 2020 Project, where we're inviting artists to submit digital files, journals, works, video recordings, Zoom productions, that kind of thing, to help document how the performing arts have been impacted over the past couple of years. So really a huge range, and it changes every day. I think at the moment, I was just teaching a class on the history of musical theater, and we were going through Julie Stein's archive. And one of my favorite things is a postcard from Stein, or to Stein, from Ethel Merman, just after the run of Gypsy. And she had gone on vacation to Florence, Italy. And on the front of the postcard, it's the statue of David. And on the back, she just writes, so how do you like them egg rolls, Mr. Goldstone? Having a wonderful time in Florence. See you when I get back. Love, Ethel. And it's just so beautifully sort of captures their relationship, their friendship, and the sort of cheeky, nod to Gypsy, of course. So
that's really fun.
Yeah.
But also a very interesting way for people to get into the archive with the other project you were describing. So
Yes,
think about that.
please.
Last question, if you could just give one piece of advice to everyone here when it comes to documenting their legacy, what would your final thoughts, if they could only walk away with one of your prime lessons?
Sure. I think there's so much discussion in our industry that performance is ephemeral. And in many ways it is, but it also leaves just an incredible legacy through documentation. Please do think about it, and don't be overwhelmed by it, and know that there are resources here like the American Theater Archive Project, like the Theater Library Association, and like institutions like the Ransom Center. We are here to have conversations with you at any point in your process. Think of us as people who can help support you in the work that you're doing. That's probably my best advice, but I can't thank you enough, Deborah, and I can't thank everybody who attended today. I really appreciate your taking the time to think through these questions.
Yes, and I hope it will be the first of many more times we get to hear from you, because I think the questions may still be coming in. But I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and we're at 4. So I hope that I'll see all of you again tomorrow for Retirement Secrets for Creatives, and then on Thursday it's our first session about DG copyright management. And that evening we have the incredible Pulitzer Prize winning playwright Lynn Nottage talking with Joy Gresham of the Lorraine Hansberry estate. So that's not to be missed. You'll learn all about what does a literary executor need to think about, and what should we be thinking about in making these plans. And legal clinics Friday, so the registration links are all in the chat. You can always see them on our website, www.thedgcm.com or .org. Either one will lead you to us. You've got all of Eric's information in the chat, and I'm sure he will welcome hearing from many of you. And you can also reach out to us if you forget how to find him. With that, have a wonderful day, and we will hopefully see you tomorrow at 3 o'clock. All right, take care, everyone.